So we are excited to present two passionate urbanists at this urban lunch. And we know that it's their reputation that is behind the heavy volume of people wanting to join us today. We've got Danny Oleksiuk and Dale McClanaghan. So our first speaker is Danny Oleksiuk. He's a lawyer and he has been a policy analyst for our Ministry of Housing, and also, of all things, in Beijing, working for the United Nations as a policy analyst. He's also been a member of Vancouver's Renter Advisory Committee. But I think his most profound influence on Vancouver is as co-founder of Abundant Housing Vancouver, and he now serves as the current president. I used to think a lot about Danny. Probably, well, I know he was born when I was thinking about him, but a very, very young kid. I used to think about him as I sat in meetings where we had public hearings and we regularly turned down housing proposals. And I used to speak about him also to the angry residents who would show up to the public hearings. And I said that I regretted that the people who had most at stake from these decisions weren't in the room, because many of them weren't even born yet. And I said, one day they're going to show up and they're going to be pissed when they see what we've done to their hopes and dreams. And sure enough, they did show up in the face of Danny Oleksiuk and all of his cohorts, the members of his cohort who really are dealing with the results of the last 50 years of urban decisions. It was in 1973, January 6th, where the city decided to downzone the West End, and to shortly after that to make as their major goal to preserve all single-family home areas. And we saw some from previous urban lunches, Jens van Bergen, who shows that more than half of the residential land of Vancouver has less people living on it today than in 1973. And a lot of the other areas have less than 1 or 2% growth per decade since 1973. So a massive de-densification of the city. At the same time, tens of thousands of bungalows on those areas were turned into large homes, and the incredible misallocation of resource that went on. So very grateful for Danny for bringing this to the public, to stand up and to make the case for housing supply and the abundant housing message. So thank you, Danny, for being here. Please, presentation.
Thanks so much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here today. And thanks everyone who's on the line for coming, including a few people who were pretty influential in making this presentation what it is. You'll, I think a few of you will recognize some of your work in what I'm going to talk about. And Sam, as Sam says, you know, here we are, the people who in some ways were not planned for over previous decades. I think there's one big idea from my presentation, which is pretty simply that we should build the most housing in the best places where the most people want to live. That's kind of I'm not a planner, but that's something that just makes sense to me. We should build the most housing in the best places where the most people want to live. And a lot follows from that. But it's arguably not what we have done, and in a lot of ways that I'm about to talk about. So with that, I'm going to try to get my screen share going. And I'm going to start by talking about the Grand Bargain in Vancouver. Can everyone give me a thumbs up if they can see that all right? Excellent. Okay, so this is a photo of much of it's built now, but of the amazing Brentwood project and the surrounding area at Willingdon and Lougheed in Burnaby. And then the Brentwood neighborhood north of that with all single family homes. I think you'll recognize the site, most of you, and you'll certainly recognize the style, which is spiky development of towers surrounded by single family homes. That is essentially the grand bargain. It was described by someone who I believe is in the audience today, former Vancouver City Councillor, 7 terms, I think, Gordon Price. And I have a quote from him here, which is that from Expo 86 to the 2010 Olympics, Vancouver accommodated growth pressures on a small fraction of the city's land while avoiding the political unpleasantness of rezoning in built-out neighborhoods. So what's the image on the left here? A couple of you might recognize it. It's from last week or this week even. A small builder in Vancouver kind of cheekily bought a 12-foot wide, I think, lot on which I don't think it's illegal. I don't believe it's legal to build anything at all. The most likely use when it went up for sale was one of the adjacent lots purchasing it and combining it. But this guy decided to put a little office on this 12-foot wide lot. And as you can see, the office has been removed. He didn't get to keep it there. Perfectly fine place for an office, but this, for me, this is just a wonderful illustration of what Price describes as the political unpleasantness of rezonings in built-out neighborhoods. You can't even put a little office on a 12-foot lot, you know. So on the one hand, you have that in Grandview Woodland. Can't even put a little building there. And then at Brentwood and elsewhere, you have these huge towers shooting up. That is the grand bargain. And that is mostly what we have. And you know, here's another way of looking at it in City of Vancouver, right? Again, some of you will recognize this one. Mostly what we've done is we've built low-rise homes where there's already low-rise homes. That's the majority of our construction activity by square footage in the City of Vancouver. The condos get a lot of press, but between, you know, condos are you know, over 4 stories is only a quarter of new square foot in Vancouver, and much less than that at below 4 stories. Mostly we tear down and rebuild single family homes. That's what the grand bargain has turned into, right? Tearing down and rebuilding $3 million single family homes while more and more people, without adding any population. Another way of looking at that is the regional picture. So while we've been tearing down and rebuilding single family homes in Vancouver, we've also been pushing development further and further afield out into, well, Surrey has grown over the last 25 years, a lot faster than Vancouver. As you can see here, Surrey is the orange bar. And if you similarly look at all population growth in Metro Vancouver, the City of Vancouver has only been, I think, about 16% of regional population growth. City of Vancouver is the blue one, Metro Vancouver is the green one. Again, so part of what I'm trying to do here is rebut the story that Vancouver has been growing so much. Most of the city has been locked down in detached homes, and people have been pushed further and further afield. So this one again is what did happen last 25 years, 1991 to 2016. Pardon me, the 2016 census is a little bit out of date right now, but that's the best we have. Looking forward, this graph is based on data from the Metro Vancouver 2050 plan, what we will do for the next 30 years. And again, no change. It doesn't seem to have been reevaluated. The City of Vancouver, again, the blue on the left will be about 16-17% of regional population growth. So that's the distribution within the region. Another thing that from this graph jumps out at me, though, is that the metro number of 1.1 million new people, so about 35,000 people a year. If you just compare that to 400,000 immigrants every year that we have at the federal level, I mean, that just strikes, I hope all of us, as a real mismatch between urban policy, municipal policy, and federal policy, right? 400,000 new immigrants, and we're planning for 35,000 in the region. And of that, only 16% of that in the City of Vancouver. I mean, that's quite worrying to me, and I hope to some of you as well, that mismatch. So that's one problem. There's not going to be enough spaces for the people who want to be here. Another problem with pushing the growth further out is transport costs. And I just found this a really striking graph. I hope you can read it, but basically, again, Vancouver's in the blue. It shows household transportation expenses. It's from a Metro Vancouver study in 2015. And it shows that Vancouver is about $4,000 less a year in transportation expenses per household than the region as an average, and about 7,000 or 8,000 less than the more expensive municipalities like Langley. That's so one lesson you can take from this: if a household gets to move from Langley to Vancouver, they can save $8,000 a year on transportation expenses, which I think is an interesting comment on the idea that Langley is more expensive than Vancouver. Housing is, but transportation, but is housing $8,000 a year more expensive in Langley than it is in Vancouver? In fact, no, I don't have that graph for you, but this same study looked at that, and the difference in transportation costs between Langley and Vancouver is larger than the difference in housing costs.
Cool.
So that overall household costs in Langley were actually more at that point. So we could save people a lot of money by building more in the city of Vancouver than in some of the other municipalities. So all of that is just kind of what has happened in Vancouver. At this point, I'm going to get a little bit into some of the theory, or some different theories of how Vancouver's run, and I hope that kind of empirical look at what has happened will inform how you think about these theories. So you'll be familiar, at least in the outline, with both of them. One of them, really prominent theory that you hear, I think either by name or in substance, and fairly frequently in Vancouver, this is the growth machine. The idea that the city is basically run as a land business, as a real estate business by local elites, and it basically has a negative effect for the local population. That growth is bad for current residents, but good for the people running the city, that it creates pollution, crowding, higher per capita costs, and that effectively growing is a transfer of wealth from local residents to a clique of local elites. Here's a local Vancouver quote from this wonderful book, Vancouver Limited, which is just a fascinating historical book from 1975. And here's this quote from it where he complains that, developers, speculators, and their political allies have systematically despoiled the urban landscape in their search for profitable ventures. That's 50 years ago. I didn't go and find a similar quote from the newspaper last week, but I'm sure if any of us went looking, we could find people saying very similar things in Vancouver 50 years later. So the growth machine theory, the city working as a growth machine, I think has a lot of purchase in Vancouver and needs to be considered and reckoned with. One reckoning with it was by this fellow named Bill Fischel, who came up with what he calls the home voter hypothesis, which is an alternative theory of the city, saying that actually it's not this group of elites and developers, it is homeowners. I've quoted NYU law prof. Vicky Bean here, describing the theory as homeowners have the greatest influence over government decisions because they control the majority of votes, and they exercise that influence to protect and maximize their housing values. So if that was true, you would expect a few things to happen. And those three things, or three of those things, are zoning officials will implement zoning to limit new development, especially near existing homeowners. Second, you'd expect them to minimize property tax impacts of new development, making new developments pay their own ways and then some. Community amenity contributions can be an example of that. And third, zoning officials may try to exclude particular racial or socioeconomic groups or the types of housing associated with those groups. And you would generally expect this home voter hypothesis to have a greater explanatory value in places with more homeowners, right? If you have a higher percentage of renters, you would expect it to not explain as much. because it's based on home voters going out and voting. And if they're a lower percentage, renters don't have that same interest in maximizing their home values through scarcity as homeowners, right? So in a place like New York City, you would expect it to not have as much explanatory value. But again, this law prof, Vicky Bean at NYU, she actually got this great data set, and she looked in the Bloomberg years in New York. Bloomberg, very pro-business mayor, 2003 to 2009. She took a look at what happened with this question of like, who's running New York, right? Is it the developers? Is it the home voters? And what she found was, I think, really interesting. She found, first of all, that more lots, first of all, 1/5 of all lots were downzoned in that time period, which was more than were upzoned. Which just by itself is, I think, a remarkable stat. We got New York City, big developers, lots and lots of renters, not as many home voters, and yet more was downzoned than upzoned. And when you look more closely at what was downzoned, you found that the downzoning was more likely in whiter, higher voter turnout, or higher home ownership areas, which is very much what you'd expect from Bill Fischel's theory about home voters. So I find that, possibly you do as well, I find that somewhat convincing that even in New York City, even during the Bloomberg years, seemed that the home voters were on net more powerful than the growth machine. So let's bring that home. Let's look at Vancouver. Let's look at what's happened in Vancouver. Let's start way back when. Let's look at a zoning map from 1965. And I think that looks pretty familiar, even if people here haven't looked at a 1965 zoning map, which, given the audience, probably a lot of you have, but that's pretty familiar. And why is that familiar? Because that's the zoning map in 2015. And let's go back and forth one more time. Look at all those white single family areas. They're almost all still white areas. Now we know a lot's happened in the colored areas, the yellow areas, the commercial kind of purple areas. And that's the development, that's the growth machine. So let's take another look at that. This is what that looks like. So you have Vancouver in the 70s and a little more recent. And that's, I love this back and forth, right? Like, this is the story that you always hear about Vancouver and have for 20 years, right? You have Vancouver was this port town and little place on the edge of the world, and then boom. And it's true, that did happen. Like, the growth machine's real. It is, developers are powerful, they got a lot built, and that's a really remarkable story. But it's just not very much of Vancouver. And it's not very much even of the development that's happened. And you can see that by just stepping back a little bit. And this is not even that far back. We're only at 25th and Oak here. We're not at the midline of the city, which I consider 41st, right? Like, there's a lot of Vancouver behind us in this image. But even this starts to tell the story. This is 1965. This is 2015. And you can see what's happened in the background, but in the foreground, very little. And again, if anyone wants to orient themselves, that's Emily Carr Elementary right in the foreground at 25th and Oak. So this is the grand bargain in images, right? You have that extreme growth in downtown, and then not that much even this close to downtown. And again, most of the city remains behind us. So that's one way of looking at the grand bargain. Here's another way. Look at a graph here. This is the growth by neighborhood in Vancouver from 1971 to 2016, 45-year period. You can see downtown at the far right grew by far the most, and then some pretty significant growth in areas like Killarney, Renfrew, Collingwood, Fairview, Kensington, Cedar Cottage, Mount Pleasant. But if you look at the left half of this chart, you see Arbutus Ridge, Riley Park, Oak Ridge, Dunbar Southlands, West Point Grey, etc., barely grew at all. And Shaughnessy, in fact, lost 2,000 people, 20% of its population over this time period. So, this is again just another view of the grand bargain. Spiky development, lots downtown, some towers around Joy Station, and then not very much in most of the city. And even the little growth that you do see in a lot of the areas where you saw some growth, that was mostly along arterials. And we'll get into that a little bit later. That's kind of a subset of the grand bargain, where within a neighborhood, like at the big picture, we build on the industrial zones and build towers there, and then nothing anywhere else. But when we do go into the quote unquote neighborhoods, we put people at the edges on the arterials. So those little blue lines you see for some of those neighborhoods are really just arterial, kind of unpleasant areas. But politically, what does this mean, right? So people have been afraid of these home voters forever. They've been quite powerful. But I guess one of the cases I want to make is that they become less powerful every year relative to the city. And it's just kind of a doomed, long-term, it's a doomed strategy in a democracy, what they're pursuing, right? Because if the growth machine areas, the downtown areas become a higher and higher percentage of the population, they just don't have a stake in maintaining those single family areas anymore, right? They just won't. Especially when they just can't afford it, right? $2 million, $3 million to get in. So I you know, part of the reason I do what I do is that I think the politics have to shift and will shift. It's built into the logic of the system. I don't know exactly when, but people just won't have a stake in as home voters. Home voters are going to get outvoted, and they have to, because the other areas are growing much more quickly, and that's kind of built into their strategy. But they can still have a lot of influence. And I just want to say a word about public consultations here. This is a map of the responses to a recent public hearing on the secured rental policy. I think there were 800 or 900 responses, over 500 in favor of the slight, very marginal upzoning. But it's just interesting to look at where that consultation is coming from, right? I mean, half of all of the correspondence was from 3 neighborhoods: Dunbar, West Point Grey, and Kitsilano. So I think one thing to point out about something like this is, while broadly you have these areas of the city are growing more quickly, if you're on council or staff, these are the people you're hearing from through traditional consultation mechanisms, and that can maybe create a skewed view of what people want and where people are at. So just going to conclude by looking at a couple that arterial development aspect of the grand bargain. So here's, like, I think pretty representative of a lot of what we have built in outside of downtown in some Vancouver neighborhoods, right? Just right, you know, one of them's even made to look like shipping containers down by the port. And again, I don't think right by the port in an industrial area or right on Kingsway is where most people want to live. It's not where I want to live. It's probably not where you would choose to live. Most of us would choose to live, if we could, somewhere more like this. This is at Arbutus Walk, and this is at UBC. These are nice little apartments on quiet streets. If we had more gradual development of wider spread areas, this is what we could be building instead of, again, building this. I just think this is a lot nicer. I think most people would prefer it. And if we could break through this home voter problem, then we could build a lot more things like this. And finally, just because I love the pre-zoning areas, and this is inspired by Elaine Berthoud's Order Without Design, I just wanted to give a shout out to some of the beautiful pre-zoning buildings and say that actually, without a lot of the zoning rules that we do have, this is what people were doing on their own. The Wilder Snail in Strathcona and this beautiful building in Chinatown. If we, and I just think that the idea that a lot of the best buildings in Vancouver, a lot of the best neighbors in Vancouver were built pre-zoning is something for everyone involved in zoning and planning to take a really hard look at and ask why that is. So with that, that's my rundown of the grand bargain. Why I don't think it will last forever. I'm not going to pick a year, but you know, time's running out. And then some ideas of what we can start to do once the grand bargain is broken down. So thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Danny. That was fascinating. I really appreciate the clarity of that presentation. Our next presenter will be Dale McClanaghan, and he's known him for many years. He's actually on the board of Granville Island. He is an expert, done a lot of work on rental housing, developer of social housing, nonprofit housing, and he was the CEO of VanCity Enterprises. That was the VanCity Credit Union subsidiary, housing subsidiary. So very grateful to Dale, and I'd like to also wish him a happy anniversary of 50 years since he met his wife in grade 9. And Dale, thank you for being here and for all the work you've done. Please.
Thank you. The 50 years is to set the time scale of what I wanted to talk about. That length of time wouldn't surprise any of you. My good luck to have recruited and retained Lillian Chan as a partner may come as a surprise when you reflect about it, but I'm grateful. And what was going on 50 years ago, I think, was a transition to a delivery of housing subsidies and supply that's worked out really well in this province. And I would characterize BC, British Columbia's social housing sector as a hidden gem, and one that has actually been very beneficial to the housing system that we have. Now, at the outset, one needs to note that this doesn't mean that the adequacy of funding for that model and for that approach is anywhere near what the need is. But in terms of the efficacy of the building, the quality of services, housing services, and the longevity of the stock has been very strong. And I'd like to sort of contrast that with what was a fork in the road 50 years ago at the federal level in terms of how to approach these things. So the benefits that I see in the non-market housing sector is a long time scale. It's competitive between housing societies that if they aspire to meet the needs of their identified groups, then they have to be competitive. They have to submit to frequent proposal calls to get yet another building. And it's led to enterprising and innovative nonprofits. Many have grown and flourished. What's nice about the system is there's an oversight, an audit function provided by the housing funder, typically BC Housing, which provides for long-term accountability on how public money is used to support housing services. And also it allows for specialization by group to either geographic, tenant group, or the type of support services that are provided. There's also been a lot of adaptation and innovation during the last 25 years, which is about how long I've been involved in the sector. I came into the non-market sector from having been a private sector developer myself, and then having been a banker in the corporate and international side. So I kind of bring a finance and development sector perspective to this, and discovered back in the 90s the benefits of the non-market sector. So the origin story on this fork in the road in terms of delivery goes back to the 1960s. And 1969, Paul Hellyer did a task force on housing, and he was addressing, frankly, the public outrage about public housing. It was slum clearances, it was freeway development, it was government driven, which meant it was the hallmarks of global public housing is standardization and paternalism. Paternalistic towards the neighbors, other levels of government, and particularly towards the tenants, who largely are seen as undeserving of all these benefits. The projects developed at that time was Regent Park in Toronto, Little Mountain in Vancouver, and across the street from where I met Lillian Chan, Blanchard Court in Victoria, which was their version of slum clearance, about 2 blocks right next to the new freeway, to the fairly newly minted ferry terminal at Swartz Bay. So Hellyer looked at this and he came back with an analysis which said the scale is too big and it's too remote from community. It's too remote. It's causing a lot of political problems and you're spending a lot of money on it. And it's a bad thing to spend money to create political problems. It's not a winning scenario. And what he recommended, what came out of that work was CMHC stopped developing, originating, and managing housing. They funded nonprofit groups, sometimes co-ops, more often societies, and they took over delivering, identifying the need, identifying the sites and opportunities. They were given capacity building funding through resource groups, development consultants, and they proceeded. Now, Ontario went one way and BC went another, and I would argue we went the right way. In Ontario, a lot of that housing stock was transferred to municipally controlled nonprofit housing societies. I'll take the example of Toronto Community Housing Corp, which is a creature of the City of Toronto. So it's got government attributes. It's about 60,000 units, which is about the size of all of BC's non-market housing sector, plus or minus 10%. And the housing government guys act an awful lot like the public housing guys did. Better, it's improvement, but you lack some of the attributes which we see in BC. So in BC, what we have is a system where BC Housing provides the funding. Thank you, province. It runs proposal calls for new projects so that groups can come forward. And there's a lot of different groups when you think about it. There's traditional community service groups, or the Legion. There's those with religious affiliations. There's nonprofit agencies. There's political anti-poverty groups. Downtown Eastside Residents Association had a strong lobbyist advocacy group. Well before that, the CCF NDP under the Winch family in Burnaby founded New Vista, which continues to work well. And the role of government became program design, funding, oversight, capacity building, and operating budget delivery and oversight. So with successive proposal calls, we've been able to steadily build the sector. One of the attributes of this system is it's built a political support base for the delivery of housing. In Ontario, they stipulated the delivery of housing by municipality from the Ontario Municipal Board, which was on a unit basis. So you got a lot of big projects next to the freeway interchange that was identified as social housing, which led to stigmatization and isolation from community. In BC, it's required, first of all, it's more fine-grained. You're required to fit in with local approvals, and the need and the architectural style is much more compatible with the rest of the community. So I wanted to sort of run through where we've been in the last 25 years with the BC model, and then I'll close on making some remarks on how we can strengthen the performance of the non-market housing by drawing a few lessons from this. So back in the 70s, there was much more generic sort of family housing, seniors housing, and the differentiation by services was very limited. You basically built a apartment building, people paid a low level of rent, and that was the extent of the program. Through the last 25 years, there's been a response by the housing providers to associated social needs and the changing face of poverty. Probably one of the first ones was the deinstitutionalization of Riverview mental health services. And the community sector that came from that includes many of those still active, which would be Coast Mental Health, Mental Patients Association, now MPA, the Sanford Housing I happen to be on the board of, which specialized in doing group homes and services in partnership with Coastal Health. around services for folks who are living with mental illness. And that model has carried on. Now I've got 9 other types of models where we've had that degree of specialization and partnership within the sectors. And the next one I would mention would be Success, which is started as and still provides settler services. I think they were originated back during the boat people immigration wave. And they've come to do a lot of seniors, complex multi-level care facilities, and a culturally appropriate in a large number of municipalities. Success has been able to really leverage their cultural connections and their social expertise with housing, and they've flourished. Dr. Peter AIDS Foundation teamed up with BC Housing and Coastal Health to deliver comfort care to people living with HIV/AIDS in the Mole Hill development. And that was particularly good at building connections between the ministry, the health ministry through Coastal Health and BC Housing. Another example is low end of market rental. Affordable Housing Society did a project in Cole Harbour, funded by BC Housing and City of Vancouver, that worked well and really presaged the low end of market activities that the province is now doing. Got one other example here that I wanted to mention, which is, or two. One is the Nikkei Housing in Burnaby teamed up with Fraser Health to provide assisted living model, really as a substitute to more complex levels of care or the market available seniors housing. And that particular prototype worked really well and morphed into the province's about 5-year-long assisted living in independent living BC. So again, these are all examples where nonprofits and BC Housing partnered on a particular project type on a particular site, and then would scale it up if it worked. I'm not giving you a list of the ones that didn't work. And then the last one I wanted to mention that was really a genuine innovation was Portland Hotel Society, who came with a completely different attitude about hard to house clients in the downtown east side. And they were able to take a pretty rundown hotel right in the center of things on Hastings and make it work with stabilizing and meeting the needs of a population with limited problems in the neighborhood. They didn't contribute to, they alleviated problems, not that they eliminated them. And they were really the model for the homeless at risk model, and then subsequent transition into the supported housing arrangements we have under the Provincial Homelessness Initiative. So under this system where there's been flexible proposal calls and funding, where the nonprofits get to demonstrate their capacity, test their ideas, and have a 50-year time frame on their buildings, not a short term, it's, I think, done really well. One of the elements that's been particularly useful has been it built a political constituency through community acceptance, and we haven't had the on-off funding problems that they have in Ontario. The guys at Toronto Community Housing in that sector were sitting ducks for the anti-government Mike Harris government, and they were out of the market at a time when, after 93, when also this CMHC got out of the market, and they're rebuilding capacity of a quasi-government sort where we've had continuity of supply. So I'd like to move on and say, what are the lessons that I draw from this industry structure that kind of quietly goes along, innovating, delivering, and responding? And I think that I'll talk about two groups that are also involved in housing. One is City of Vancouver, which in the last 10 years has put a lot of resources into the discussion of housing. They've created a subsidiary for the delivery of it. They've got some of the authority is lodged in planning, some of it is in finance and real estate, some of it in a programming department, and some in their development subsidiary, Vancouver Affordable Housing Agency. And what I see in terms of outcomes is weak and slow and expensive, where they compete to receive provincial funding, where all the nonprofits also compete. They've had a low success rate, and where they've developed their own projects and put them out for RFPs for long-term operators, they've had low participation rates because often their control demands and their budgeting is unrealistic. So I think we would look forward to the day when the city of Vancouver will try to reconsolidate its response to housing in the social realm, the social housing realm, by becoming more coherent, less controlled about who's in control, and better about genuinely partnering with the housing sector. The other group that I'll mention is CMHC, who, as we all know, got out of the business in '93, and then about 3 or 4 years ago, came back in with a housing strategy and a lot of appropriations. And in that instance, they've got 2 major investment channels. One's not working in BC very well at all, and one's doing, frankly, just fine. The rental construction finance initiative, which is low end of market rental, is what they do all day, core business. They finance development, they underwrite risk in the mortgage insurance business. They know capital markets. They know enough about the Vancouver rental scene to be able to place funds and manage their portfolio. And that one reportedly is doing quite well. Even the conservative critic tells me that particularly outside the large centers, that rental financing initiative has done just well. The co-investment fund, which is basically the social deep core need aspect, has had very, very low take up. And this was identified and highlighted by MP Jenny Kwan, who found that the ability by CMHC to place funding for qualifying projects was exceedingly low. And I think that's because, one, the program development is done in Ontario. The analysts are done in Ontario. The analysts know the rental market. They don't know the non-market. They don't know when you get responses back from their underwriting people, they don't show a knowledge of local conditions in terms of cost-based land or who the players are. Often there's parallel funding contributions from both BC Housing and CMHC, and inevitably BC Housing's approvals and knowledge base is much more advanced than CMHC. So what we look forward to in that regard is for CMHC to discover the strength in the non-market housing sector, for them to learn from their counterparts at BC Housing, who it is federal and it is provincial, so there's a natural rivalry there. But with this shared goal, I think that, and some good connections at the political level, I think that CMHC could really up its game in delivery of the funding, which has been appropriated. I mean, we're at an implementation problem. We're not at a strategy problem. We're not at a funding problem. We need to just deploy what's already been allocated. And I would argue that the BC nonprofit housing sector is demonstrated that innovation and willingness to deliver.
Gail, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Especially, I didn't know that about the difference between Ontario and BC. Same federal program, but totally different approach. And we have so much to be grateful for the nonprofit housing sector in BC. So we have a bit of time for questions. You can either put into the Q&A or directly to Sebastian. Zane is agreed to once again handle our, be the moderator for our Q&A. Sebastian, take it away.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Dale and Danny. Vancouver is very lucky to have leaders of your caliber, all three of you. So let's jump into some questions. So Gordon Price has posited that renters are grand bargainers, or perhaps home voters too, with policies like rent control, tenure control, and increasingly we're seeing the ring fencing of rental neighborhoods, such as in the draft Broadway plan. So how do you model renter behavior in the home voter model or grand bargain model?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, I think almost taking it to a higher level of abstraction, like it's almost not the right line to draw. Like it's people who are here already and people who haven't come yet. I think it's true renters who are already here with rent control have certain interests, and they may not want either for fear of dumb eviction or because they just don't want their neighborhood to change. I think Gordon has a really good point there. I also think it points at something about William Fischel's theory that's like it's a little bit too economic for me. I don't think it actually describes. I don't think that homeowners are actually purely financially motivated. There's a lot of other motivations there other than pure financial maximization. And I think that you see that with renters who don't have this financial stake, but they do have an idea of what they want their neighborhood to be, maybe. But renters in Lethbridge who want to come here, or homeowners, a condo owner in Kelowna who wants to move to Vancouver, or in Chandigarh who might be immigrating here, you know. Again, take it's my big principle, like build the most housing in the areas in the best areas where the most people want to live. And that might not always be what the renter or the homeowner who's currently in that place wants, but it's probably best for everybody. It's best for the renter who wants to move to Toronto from Vancouver, that Toronto follows that strategy. And I think one of the things that follows from this is having higher levels of government make some of these choices to balance these interests might be a solution, because when every little area makes its own little rules about what's best for it, the people in that area might be hurt by the rules that people in other areas are making.
Completely agreed. I'll give you one more on the grand bargain before we move on to one for Dale. So question from Maria: what qualities are you looking for in the next mayor and council to address the grand bargain?
I mean, I think we've someone who's going to let people into those exclusionary neighborhoods. I mean, I think the West End is great. I don't think we should have stopped at one. And I think I want to see someone who wants to build a few more West Ends I want to live near the beach personally. And I want to have a subway line. And I don't think I'm alone. So yeah, I want to see a mayor and council that wants to build something like the West End in Dunbar and Point Grey and Kerrisdale, and connect it all with rapid transit.
Sounds beautiful. So to Dale, a question from Ralph Sultan. He said the provincial government has a commitment to build 114,000 below market homes. It seems progress is a bit slow on this. What's your advice on how to best speed it up and build that housing at scale?
I think probably the biggest bottleneck is around approvals and land use, and it's bedeviled local government for a few decades on how to improve delivery of permits. And I think it's one of those things you just have to keep working towards on. We ask a lot of our new developments in housing, energy performance and aesthetics, and to fund community amenity charges. In many places, we also have to fund infrastructure to support that. Less so in Vancouver, more so in Surrey. So I think we have to find, I think at the core of it, better ways to help finance housing growth on the infrastructure side, working with the municipalities. And I think we have to give them maybe some more tools in terms of approvals, but I'm very uneasy about taking out the public hearing steps and the community voice in the altogether too painful, but I think necessary zoning process.
And on the similar note, Sarah Ellis has a question, how to put non-market providers on a more even footing with the private sector when it comes to things like land acquisition and financing.
Perhaps a little bit more pre-funding to groups to do some land acquisition and assemblies. I think that's probably quick access to capital is very hard when the nonprofit is doing the origination phase. But I would say that one thing the province is very good. BC Housing is very good. Once they determine a project is a go, their pre-development funding is very robust and often has up to $500,000 for architecture planning approvals processes. We're not at as much of a disadvantage as you would think, but that's very expensive land, and it means the funder and the public gets fewer units for a given $1 million of funding.
Right, thank you, Dale. And this one can go to either of you, and feel free to answer however you'd like. It's a common question we hear. What's your projection of how many units we need over the next 30 years in Vancouver, and for how many people? Is this even a question we can answer?
Okay. I'm not going to answer that. I learned a long time ago, if you do a credible forecast and provide the number, anybody that might help you build it runs away. They don't want. So I think that we just need to keep improving our housing system. We need to take a systemic approach to understanding that many of the problems, the barriers that we have, are common across the different tenure and locations. And so I think we need to keep a very strong and overt enablement strategy going. And I think the way it will work is the market will fill what it can fill, and then the non-market will fill priority areas. And we've got a lot of priority areas. You know, we've actually, in the last 25 years, had to resort to a shelter strategy. We've got a three-part non-market response. One is ignore them, leave them on the street. 2, get them a shelter. And 3, try to transition into low barrier housing. And the social tolerance of leaving folks and families on the street is something that I never thought 50 years ago one would have to observe. It is far too frequently accepted within our society. It's really shocking.
That is intolerable, and thank you for drawing attention to it. Do we have time for one more question, Sam?
We're going to have to say goodbye. Something quick, perhaps.
Okay, quick one to Danny from Michael Gelzert. How would you streamline community engagement such that it becomes an asset to effective urban planning rather than a roadblock?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, first of all, I wouldn't make it any harder to build an apartment building than to build a detached home that costs $3 million. I don't see any principled reason for that. And a detached home can just be built without a public hearing right now. So why the heck do we subject an apartment to that? Both or neither, but doing it for one but not the other is so yeah. I mean, if we don't need it for a detached home, why do you need it for an apartment? There's nothing bad about apartments.
Okay, I think we're going to have to. We're very clear on the urban lunch. We respect your time, and we thank everyone who has joined us. Somebody has asked, are we going to have a video of this? Yes, that will come out. We have a playlist of the 5 urban lunch we've already had. Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you to our 2 excellent speakers. Really appreciate the quality of this presentation. I'd also like to thank Lynn Zanata, who has done all of the organizing and the technical work on this. So thank you. We are going to have another urban lunch in January. So we welcome you to come back, and we're going to have some equally excellent speakers. Thanks all for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.